I still hear her voice the way it sounded in that moment. Sharp, cold, and loud enough for the people nearby to lift their heads. "You're too stubborn to change, Dad." She said it like a fact she had repeated many times, as if explaining a problem to strangers. I stood there with my coat in my hands, feeling something inside me tighten in a way I hadn't felt before. It wasn't just the words. It was the tone, the distance, the way she didn't even look at me when she said it. I froze for a second, wondering why patience, something I learned through decades of living, had become evidence of some flaw in me. I had always believed patience was one of the few strengths age still allowed me, but the way she said it made me feel like it had somehow turned into a burden she no longer wanted to carry. We were standing in the lobby of the small cafe we used to go to when she was younger. I had been excited when she suggested meeting there. I thought maybe it meant she wanted a quiet evening with her father, the way we used to talk over warm drinks when life felt simple. But as soon as I walked in, she looked annoyed, almost embarrassed. She glanced at my jacket, at my slow steps, at the way I paused to scan the room. None of these things had bothered her before, but now they seemed to irritate her. She brushed past me when she walked toward the counter. "You always take too long," she muttered, not fully under her breath. I felt the sting, not because of the words, but because of the way she didn't try to soften them. There was a time when she used to wait for me, hold my arm, adjust her pace so we walked side by side. Now it felt like she wanted to be anywhere but near me. As she ordered, I watched her shoulders stiffen whenever I moved. She acted as if my presence threw her off balance. When the barista asked if we were sitting together, she shook her head quickly. "He'll take his time," she said, like she was talking about someone who slowed her day down. It shocked me more than I expected. I stood there, unsure of my place in a room that once held memories of laughter and shared stories. Then she turned to me with that same cold tone and said, "We'll talk later. I have some future planning I need to handle for you soon." She said it too smoothly, too confidently, as if decisions about my life were already being made without me. I didn't understand what she meant, but the certainty in her voice made me uneasy. It was the first sign that something deeper was changing, something I wasn't prepared for. When she stepped aside to take a call, she angled her body away from me. She whispered as if my hearing didn't matter anymore. I caught only fragments. "Schedule, documents, he won't keep up much longer." I wanted to ask what she meant, but I could feel how distant she already was. Something about her posture told me she saw me as a task, not a father. After she hung up, she told me she didn't have time to sit together after all. "You should head home, Dad. We'll meet another day." Her eyes didn't match the promise. They looked tired of me. I nodded because I didn't want to make a scene, but my chest felt tight when she turned her back to fix her hair in the reflection of the cafe window. As I walked toward the door, I realized something had shifted, not in her voice, but in her heart. I didn't know the full shape of it yet, but I felt it settling over me like a shadow. What would you feel if your patience became something used against you? The first time she came by after that cafe incident, I tried to believe she was simply checking in. I told myself she wanted to make sure I was doing well, that maybe she regretted how abruptly she had spoken to me that day. But as soon as she stepped inside, I felt her eyes scanning everything, my routine, my movements, even the way I placed my shoes near the door. It wasn't concern, it was inspection. She didn't sit down or ask how I was feeling. Instead, she walked straight to the kitchen. "You shouldn't leave dishes drying like this," she said, already rearranging the rack. Then it was the medicine cabinet. Then the way I folded towels. Every observation came with the same tone, patient on the surface, but laced with judgment beneath. It wasn't what she said. It was how small her voice made me feel. I told her I'd been doing things this way for years. She shook her head, as if that proved her point. "Exactly, Dad. You don't adapt well anymore." She said it loudly enough that the open windows carried her voice outside, where my neighbors watered their lawns. I watched one of them glance up, sympathetic and uncomfortable. That look hurt more than her words. It was the look people give someone they believe is slipping. She kept walking around the house like she was taking inventory. When she reached the bookshelf, she started shifting photo frames and pushing my notebooks aside. "These things should be moved. They're hazards," she said. She didn't ask if she could move anything. She didn't consider that each item was where I kept it because it mattered to me. She simply repositioned things to fit her idea of how an older man should live. I followed her quietly, feeling the space around me shrink. I didn't understand when my home, the place I built with confidence and routine, became something she felt entitled to reorganize. She opened drawers, frowned, and closed them without explanation. "I'll help you sort this later," she said, as if I was losing the ability to manage it myself. It wasn't until the phone rang that I felt a deeper shift. I reached for it, but she stepped in front of me, answering before I could say a word. "He's resting right now," she told the caller. "I'll take a message." Resting. I was standing right there. When she hung up, she gave me a soft, almost pitying look. "Some calls aren't good for you, Dad. I'll handle them." I didn't know who decided that I needed protection from my own conversation. Later, she introduced her partner, a tall man with a rehearsed smile and a handshake that lasted too long. "He keeps older adults on track," she said proudly. He nodded like he already understood me, already classified me. He asked questions, too many questions, about my habits, my routines, my finances, and whether I had thought about the future. I answered carefully, but I could feel something tightening in my chest. He spoke to me like someone assessing a client, not a father. A few days after their visit, I noticed a small change in the mailbox. A letter from the insurance company arrived later than expected. Another never showed up at all. When I asked my daughter about it, she shrugged. "Mail gets lost sometimes," but her eyes shifted away too quickly. Something felt wrong, even if I couldn't name it yet. That night, I sat on the couch and looked around my own home, the place that once reflected my choices, and realized it no longer felt fully mine. Her fingerprints were everywhere. Her judgments lingered on every shelf she had rearranged, and for the first time, I felt less like a father and more like a project she planned to manage. The first envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, a plain white envelope with my name printed neatly across the front. Nothing unusual. But inside was a notice from my bank about updated preferences for online access and account management. Preferences I knew I hadn't touched. At first, I thought it was a mistake from the bank itself. People get wrong mail all the time. But when I looked again, my address, my name, my account details, they were all correct. I set the paper on the table, staring at the unfamiliar language. "Your recent changes will take effect within 3 to 5 business days." Changes? I hadn't made any. I hadn't spoken to anyone from the bank in months. I folded the notice and placed it beside me, telling myself I'd call later. But something in my chest tightened in a way I couldn't ignore. 2 days later came an insurance letter about updated beneficiaries and coverage adjustments. Again, my name, my address, my policy number. But the details were foreign to me, and the date of supposed approval made my stomach drop. When I asked my daughter if she knew anything about it, she waved it off with a dismissive smile. "Dad, we talked about those changes months ago," she said. "You really don't remember? You agreed we needed to modernize everything." Her tone wasn't accusing, but it carried something worse. Certainty. Certainty that the problem was me. Certainty that my memory, not the paperwork, was failing. I opened my mouth to argue, but she placed a hand on my shoulder, gentle but heavy. "It's okay," she added. "I'll keep track of things." That afternoon, I went to fetch my checkbook to review my recent transactions. The drawer where I kept it wouldn't open. I tried the handle again. Locked. I never locked that drawer. I didn't even own a key for it. And yet, there it was, sealed shut, as if someone wanted to protect something from me rather than for me. When I mentioned it to her later, she looked me directly in the eye and said, "You probably misplaced the key." I felt something inside me bend, not break. Just bend enough that I knew I couldn't take her explanations at face value anymore. Her partner visited the next morning. He walked through the door with the confidence of someone who believed he belonged there. He didn't bother with small talk. Instead, he went straight into asking pointed questions, questions no one outside my family should ask. "So, how many accounts do you manage? Do you have investments or just savings? Have you ever considered letting someone else handle the complicated stuff?" Each question felt like a hand reaching into my pocket. I answered as carefully as I could, but his curiosity wasn't casual. It was calculated. He looked around my living room like he was sizing up what was there and what could be taken. After they left, I sat down with a notebook. I hadn't needed one before, but something told me I needed to track every date, every visit, every odd envelope that arrived. I wrote down the bank notice, the insurance letter, the locked drawer, her sudden confidence in my supposed memory loss. And as I looked over the list, a quiet dread settled over me. Financial inconsistencies began appearing in places I never expected. Small withdrawals I didn't remember making. automatic transfers that hadn't been scheduled before. Each one looked harmless alone, easy to explain, but together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. That night, I sat in the dim light of my living room, holding those letters, feeling the weight of something shifting beneath my life, without my permission. And for the first time, fear took a very clear shape. She wasn't updating things. She was building something. Something with my name, but not my memory. What would you think if decisions appeared with your name, but not your memory? I realized something had shifted the day she took me to the clinic. It was supposed to be a routine checkup, blood pressure, medication review, nothing complicated. I sat across from the doctor, ready to answer the usual questions, when my daughter spoke before I could open my mouth. "Dad's been getting forgetful and stubborn lately," she said. Not worried, not confused, certain. The words felt like a bucket of cold water poured straight down my back. I turned to look at her, hoping I'd see a smile or some sign she'd misspoken. But she stayed focused on the doctor, building a picture of me I didn't recognize. She described moments I knew didn't happen, twisting small mistakes into signs of decline. And as she talked, the doctor's posture shifted. He looked at me with the same gentle concern people give strangers on the street. I wanted to speak up. I wanted to correct her, but my voice felt pinned beneath the shock. When I finally managed to say, "I'm fine," my daughter placed her hand on my arm with a soft sigh. "Dad, you don't have to pretend." That single sentence softened the ground beneath me. My truth sounded like denial, and her story sounded like fact. Later that week, I tried logging into my medical portal to check my records. The system refused my password. I tried the security questions, then the reset link. Everything failed. When I called the clinic, the receptionist said my access had been temporarily restricted. She spoke slowly, as if afraid she might confuse me. Restricted, from my own medical information. When I asked why, she said she couldn't discuss it over the phone, but that family support was helping manage things now. My daughter was the family support. I stared at the blank screen, feeling the ground tilt again as the realization settled in. She had cut me out of my own life. The next day, she arrived with a folder. "Just some safety forms," she said, placing it in front of me as if it were nothing important. The papers were thick, filled with legal phrases. She guided me to the signature lines, her voice soft and encouraging. But as I scanned the pages, the language frightened me. Financial authority, decision-making oversight, permission to act in emergencies. It was written in careful terms, but I recognized enough to know it wasn't just about safety. It was control. I pushed the folder away. She smiled too quickly and said we could review it later. But the folder stayed in her hands as she left, like something she planned to bring back when I was more agreeable. Soon after, I began missing appointment reminders. Some were moved. Others vanished entirely. When I confronted her, she told me I must have forgotten. But the truth came the day I found a stack of unopened letters in her car. My name, my address, my doctor's. She hadn't even bothered to hide them well. She was filtering my world before it ever reached me. I started speaking less around her. Every slip of memory, every moment of hesitation felt like ammunition she could use. I measured my words, keeping them short, simple, and careful. It felt like shrinking, like folding myself into a smaller person just to avoid being labeled something I wasn't. But even with all my caution, the damage was already done. When I spoke to the doctor again, his eyes carried doubt before I said a single word. When I called the clinic, staff sounded rehearsed, polite, and distant. My daughter's version of me had spread quietly, like a story people wanted to believe. By the end of that month, I understood something painful and irreversible. I was losing credibility, not because of who I was, but because of who she claimed I was becoming. Have you ever feared someone rewriting your story while you were still alive? I spent most of my life believing patience was a kind of love, not loud, not showy, just steady, reliable, and always there when someone needed it. When my daughter called me too stubborn to change, she said it with the tone people use for lost causes, but she never knew what that patience actually cost me, or how many years it took to build the life she now treats so lightly. I remember the early mornings when she was little. When I worked the opening shift at the hardware store and the closing shift at the diner, I'd come home smelling like coffee and sawdust, and she'd run into my arms like none of it mattered. She never knew how many times I closed my eyes in the storeroom just to stay awake. She never knew how many times I worked through holidays so she could have presents, warm meals, and a sense of normal childhood joy. There were nights when the bills were taller than my hope. I'd sit at the kitchen table long after she'd fallen asleep, penciling numbers until they finally made sense. Every time her school raised tuition, I found an extra shift. Every time she needed supplies or fees or uniforms, I found a way. I took jobs most people ignored. I walked to work when the car barely survived each winter. I smiled when she assumed everything came easy. That was the point. I wanted her world to be soft, even if mine was worn thin. She never knew about the envelope in the back of my closet, the one labeled only with her name. Every month I slipped a little cash inside. Sometimes it was $10, sometimes $50. On rare lucky months, $100. I didn't tell her because it wasn't meant to be a lesson. It was meant to be a safety net, something she could fall into if life ever turned on her. I built it through patience that stretched further than my paycheck. When college came around, she believed the scholarships were enough. She didn't see the years I spent repairing neighbors' roofs on weekends or fixing old tractors for cash. She didn't know that by the time she walked across that stage in her cap and gown, I had 3 jobs, not because I wanted to, but because I wanted her to walk into adulthood without the weight that sat on my shoulders at her age. She used to say, "Dad, you're the calmest person I know." She meant it as a compliment. She didn't understand it was a habit built from necessity, one that held my life together. I learned not to panic when things broke. I learned not to complain when life was unfair. I learned to make tight corners livable and impossible days survivable. So when she called me stubborn, it stung in a way I can't describe. Not because she judged me, but because she misunderstood everything patience ever meant. She looked at the slow steps I take now, the routines I keep, the care I give to the few things I can still manage, and she decided it meant I was resistant, unwilling, outdated. But the truth is, simple. I survived life by being steady. She thrived because I was steady. Now, as I sit alone in my quiet house, I look back at those years and realize something I never saw before. I didn't raise her with strictness or rules. I raised her with sacrifice. Quiet, unadvertised, invisible sacrifice. And maybe that's why she never learned to see it. Maybe silence hid everything I meant for her to understand. But those years still matter. The work still matters. The patience still matters. And now, as her behavior grows sharper and more dismissive, I feel something new rising inside me. Not anger, not revenge, but a steady, grounded resolve. My sacrifices deserve protection, even if she never appreciated them. I didn't go looking for trouble that morning. I was only trying to clear papers from the kitchen table, the same way I used to sort through bills back when life felt simpler. But buried beneath grocery receipts and old envelopes was a bank statement I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it was a duplicate I had forgotten to toss. Then I noticed the date. Last month. I knew I hadn't opened anything from the bank in weeks. My daughter had been handling the mail lately, as she liked to say. I sat down, pulled the statement closer, and felt a quiet heaviness settle inside me. There were withdrawals I couldn't explain, transfers that didn't match anything I remembered authorizing. A new account number appeared in a corner with my name at the top, but I had never opened another account. My hands shook, not from age, but from the realization that something was happening behind my back. Another email sat printed behind the statement. It was addressed to me, but forwarded from an unknown sender. My daughter must have overlooked it. I read slow, line by line, and felt the air thicken. It mentioned updates to account permissions and a secondary user added for easier management. The secondary user was listed with initials that matched her partner's name. I had never agreed to any of it. I pushed the papers aside and reached for my checkbook out of instinct. It wasn't in the drawer. I checked the counter, the shelf, the side table. Nothing. The drawer where I kept important documents felt heavier than usual, and when I pulled it, I saw a small lock hanging from it, a lock I never put there. My throat tightened. She had been visiting more lately, opening cabinets, moving things, offering advice wrapped in pity. Now I understood the purpose behind her careful rearranging. I began writing dates in a notebook. Simple lines at first, her visits, her tone, the changes in her behavior. Then I added the bank statement dates. They lined up more neatly than I wished they did. Every time she visited, every time she checked in, a withdrawal appeared within days. She wasn't just stepping into my routines, she was stepping into my accounts. That afternoon, I walked to the bank. I didn't drive because I needed time to gather myself. The air felt heavy, but the repetition of my steps kept me steady. When I reached the branch, I asked to speak with a manager. The woman who greeted me had kind eyes. She didn't rush me. She listened as I placed the papers on her desk one by one. She leaned forward as she read, her expression tightening. She asked calm, careful questions. Had I granted permission? Did I recognize the transactions? Did I add a user? Each time I shook my head. She looked at the printed email again, tracing the line with the added name. Then she exhaled in a way that told me she already knew this wasn't right. She explained the process gently. She talked about patterns of concern and potential exploitation indicators. Her words were clinical, but I felt them like blows. She asked if anyone had been helping me manage my finances recently. I told her about my daughter, my routines, her corrections, the mail she had started collecting, the decisions she said she would handle. The manager nodded slowly, not with judgment, but with recognition. She slid the papers into a folder and told me they needed to begin an internal review. Her tone was firm, respectful, and serious. She said this kind of situation was more common than people believed. She reassured me that my accounts would be monitored and that no changes would be allowed without direct confirmation from me. I walked home feeling cracked open. Shock blended quietly with hurt, but beneath both, something steadier began to form. Clarity. Numbers didn't lie. They didn't twist the truth or hide behind excuses. They told me exactly what she had been doing while calling me stubborn, outdated, and in need of her guidance. For the first time, I wasn't questioning myself. I was questioning her. I didn't call her to fight. I called her because the truth had finally taken shape, and I needed to hear her explain it in her own voice. When she arrived, she walked in with the confidence of someone who believed she still had full control over the story. I laid the folder on the table between us. It wasn't thick, but every page inside it held something she never expected to see again. Evidence she had meant to keep only in her hands. "I want you to look at these," I said quietly. My voice didn't shake. It surprised me. She glanced at the papers and then at me, irritation flashing before she even read a single line. "Dad, we've been over this. You're remembering things wrong." I slid the first statement toward her. The unauthorized withdrawals, the new account number, her partner listed as a secondary user. She pushed it back with 2 fingers, as if touching it might admit the truth she didn't want to face. "You approved that months ago," she said. Her tone clipped. "You just forget these things now." I had anticipated that. I placed the printed email next, the one she forgot to hide, the one that said her partner requested access updates. Her eyes flickered just for a moment, and that tiny break in her expression told me everything. "Why is his name on my accounts?" I asked. She stood up as if movement could erase the question. "Because you needed help. You said you were overwhelmed. Don't you remember?" Her words sharpened. "This is exactly why I've been telling the doctor you're slipping." There it was. The story she had been building behind my back, laid out plainly. She didn't step closer. She hovered near the doorway as though distance could shield her. Before she could continue, there was a knock at the door. 2 officials stood outside, wearing the quiet seriousness I had dreaded yet depended on. They introduced themselves, then handed me formal notices. Confirmation of an ongoing investigation, temporary restrictions on access to my accounts, and documentation that I, not she, was the primary point of contact now. Her face drained. The officials asked her a few straightforward questions. She tried to answer with authority, but every sentence contradicted the paperwork in their hands. They pointed out the dates, the transactions, the name additions, the timing of her visits. They didn't accuse her with harsh words. They simply laid facts in front of her and asked for explanations that didn't exist. She glanced at me in confusion, not the kind born of innocence, but the shock of losing control of something she thought she had sealed shut. She blamed the bank. She blamed the system. She blamed misunderstanding. She even blamed me again, insisting I twisted everything. But the numbers didn't twist. The emails didn't twist. The signatures she claimed I'd given didn't match mine. Every story she tried to offer collapsed under the weight of her own patterns. When the officials asked her partner's involvement, she faltered again. They explained that the financial links were already under review. She swallowed hard, then grabbed her bag with a force that filled the room with finality. "You just can't handle change," she snapped. "This is why I tried to help. Help? She said it like a gift I had rejected. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just watched her storm out, leaving the door open behind her. The officials closed it gently, and in the stillness that followed, I understood something I had avoided for months. She never wanted my patience. She wanted my obedience. She wanted the version of me she could manage, rewrite, and quiet whenever it suited her. But the moment she walked out, her patience ran out, and mine finally began. What should a parent do when the truth is treated like an inconvenience? The house feels different now, not because anything changed inside it, but because I finally reclaimed the rhythm of my own steps. I wake when I choose, not when someone decides an appropriate schedule for me. I make my coffee the way I always have, slow, steady, the scent rising in the quiet morning light. It's a small thing, but small things matter when you've spent months being told you're losing control over them. Since the investigation started, there has been a quietness in my life that feels earned. No one moves my belongings for safety. No one watches my habits like I'm an experiment. No one answers my phone for me, or screens my calls, or redirects my mail to places I never agreed to. I didn't realize how heavy that interference felt until it was gone. The space around me has opened again, and I can finally hear myself think. In those quiet hours, I found myself remembering the years that shaped both our lives, hers and mine. I remember the patience it took to raise her. Patience through her fears, her stubborn phases, her doubts. Patience through nights when I worked late, then came home to help her with school projects or calm her worries. Patience when money was tight, and I hid how hard I was working so she wouldn't feel the weight of it. It was the one thing I always had to give, even when nothing else was certain. She once saw that patience as love. Now she calls it stubbornness. That thought used to cut into me like something sharp and undeserved. But lately, it has settled into something else, an understanding I wish I didn't have to reach. She never learned the difference between patience and control. She thought guiding her life meant she could reshape mine. She thought the years I spent waiting, supporting, sacrificing were traits she could use against me once she decided I wasn't adapting quickly enough for her comfort. She mistook steadiness for weakness. She mistook my quiet ways for limitations, and she mistook her rising impatience for my failure to change. But the truth sits with me now, steady and unshakable. I wasn't stubborn. I was constant. I was reliable. I was the same patient father who held her through storms she forgot I carried her through. The routines she mocked were the same ones that kept our lives together when everything else was uncertain. She didn't see that. She didn't want to. Now, when I look back on the moment she dismissed me, the moment she told me I was too stubborn to change, I realize she wasn't speaking about me at all. She was speaking from her own frustration, her own lack of patience, her own need for control. She thought she could correct me, reshape me, manage me the same way she tried to manage her world. But life has a way of teaching lessons at its own pace. And the lesson she never learned is the one she needs most now. Patience is not something you demand from others. It's something you practice yourself. Without it, every relationship becomes something to manage rather than something to cherish. My dignity, my autonomy, my history, they are mine. They don't belong to paperwork someone else fills out. They don't belong to narratives someone else creates. They don't belong to a child who grew impatient with the father who held his patience for her. Entire life, I don't know what she will become after this. The investigation continues, and the consequences will fall wherever the truth directs them. I won't soften them. I won't shield her from them. I won't rewrite any part of what happened. But in the quiet of my days, I do wonder one thing. What becomes of a person who never learned the patience that raised them? What remains of patience when the person you raised never learned it from you?